Well, your half-crazy pastor forgot to turn his microphone on Sunday morning. So, I am re-recording this week's teaching from my office. Let's hope that this goes relatively smoothly. Now, this week we are looking at Paul's instructions to wives. And you'll see here on your screen is our text. Now, I went ahead and decided to pick up at verse 21. And while we're here, let's just make a few comments about the translation. Um, First, the word that I translate as a command, subordinate yourselves in verse 21, is actually a participle. You don't get a main verb, a finite verb, until you go all the way back to verse 18, be filled with the Spirit. And then after that, what you get is you get a series of 5 participles, all of which unpack what it means to be filled with the Spirit, or at least the results of being filled with the Spirit. So Paul uses those participles to explain what he means. And so what that does is, grammatically, it makes the household code inseparable from this discussion of the wise and spirit-filled life in verses 15 through 21. So he says, subordinate yourselves to one another out of reverence for, out of fear of Christ. It is actually the word phobos, and you know that word if you think about it, the English word phobia. Okay, it's the same idea, but the idea here is not so much a fear as it is a reverence or a respect. And we know that because Paul uses a similar root, or actually the same root, down in verse 33, where he tells wives, wives should respect or fear, phabeomai is the verb there, their husbands. Okay. Now, the other thing that I want to observe is you'll see a few imperatives sprinkled throughout here addressed to wives. Wives, submit to your husbands, etc. But actually, in the Greek text, Paul never explicitly addresses wives with an imperative. As far as I'm aware, the wife is the only one addressed in the household code that is not addressed with an explicit imperative. Now, we'll talk about why I think that is later on as we go through our teaching. Okay. Notice the justification there in verse 23. The husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. And then Paul sort of repeats the command, or at least what I would more describe as his plea to wives to submit to their husbands in verse 24. But again, he does so without addressing the wife with an imperative. Even the command down in verse 33, for the husband, it's an imperative. For the wife, it is a present subjunctive, which can also have the force of a command. But it's still interesting that Paul is doing, he's not doing anything grammatically wrong, but he is doing a little bit of grammatical gymnastics not to address the wife with a subjunctive, or with an imperative, I should say, with an imperative. Now, we've got the text in front of us, And we need to acknowledge from the outset that these are not necessarily comforting words for the modern emancipated woman. Modern women understand how these words have been used against them. They get that. And even if they don't, even if they're new to Christianity, maybe especially if they're new to Christianity, these words just feel out of place in our modern world with its assumptions about equality and with its fear of systems of power. Indeed, one could understand why a modern woman might not want to take upon herself the burden of Christian marriage, might even walk away from Christianity altogether. But here's what I want to suggest. I want to suggest that reading the text in such a negative way actually misses the point that Paul's trying to make. And in so doing, we miss Paul's vision for a more wholesome and a more Christ-like way to be human. Now, in this series, we have done a heck of a lot of background work, heck of a lot of context work, but we're not through. You see, when we traced the story of women in America, we only got up to about 1979. That's as far as Michelle Lee Barnwell went with her study. And we've got to go further because it's important not only to understand the context from which Paul wrote, it's also important to understand the context in which we read. And that context has been shaped by the battle of the sexes. Now, if you are a younger reader, or maybe a reader from a non-North American context, you may not be familiar with that term. It was very popular in the 1980s and 1990s. And I almost put pictures here of the commentator Rush Limbaugh and one of his favorite feminist targets for ridicule, a woman named Molly Yard. In fact, he used to refer to her as Sergeant Major Molly Yard for her ability to marshal crowds in favor of her position. But I think that representation would have misled us in a couple of ways. Limbaugh and Yard were essentially secular figures. They were figures of American politics. They were not figures of the church, though Limbaugh tried to ingratiate himself to evangelicals as much as he could. The problem is that this battle of the sexes, even though the language is no longer used, the battle is still going on, and it has moved from the secular political arena and from the secular workspace to the Christian church. Now, let me back up and say something that I said Sunday morning, but that I almost forgot to say here. The battle of the sexes referred to the competition between men and women in the workplace for positions, for pay, for authority, for influence, for status. And one thing I didn't say Sunday morning is that it also refers to the battle that men and women waged with one another over political viewpoint, over view of the world, really. And I would just put that behind your ear for a second, and we'll get back to it. Okay. So I didn't use Limbaugh and Yard because they are secular. I also didn't use them because they are older. Limbaugh has passed away. Yard may have passed away as well. I don't know. But these are figures of the past. The ones I have on your screen are figures that are much more relevant for the present. Uh, Douglas Wilson is a pastor in Idaho. He has a huge online following, especially among young males. And he and some of his cohorts are the first to seriously consider the disenfranchisement of women. What do I mean by that? Well, they are among the first to consider, as far as I know, seriously consider the repealing of women's rights to vote. The other person I have here is Rachel Held Evans. And before her very untimely death, she was a prominent spokesperson against complementarianism. In fact, she went around the country and interviewed women who were involved in the so-called biblical womanhood movement and wrote about her experiences, really trying to show that this whole idea advocated by Doug Wilson, is not good for women. I don't know if she doesn't really have him in mind specifically. There's a lot of other people who want to subjugate women in certain ways. These two figures are representative of warring parties, you might say, in the church. And as David French observed last week on Russell Moore's podcast, these disagreements have become coded for politics. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that when people see a woman, they assume certain things about her politically. The same thing as for a man. And then they begin to associate certain virtues with womanhood, certain virtues with manhood, and they begin to collate those into positive or negative. That only heightens the conflict, particularly in our polarized context. And what I'm wanting to argue is that even though Paul is speaking to the household, something that we really don't do in the modern world, I'm wanting to argue that those words are still exceedingly relevant for our context, precisely because our context is mired in this gendered socio-political conflict. And that what Paul wants to do for us is to present a different vision for how husbands and wives ought to relate to one another. One that is rooted in the kingdom and that actually provides a model for how all Christians ought to relate to one another. So, in order to understand this text, we have to start in the right place. Or you might say the right places. One of the things that we have to do is we have to start with the right questions. Now, questions of authority, and especially questions of rights or equality or fair treatment, I prefer fair treatment. I think those are important questions, and they do have to be dealt with. But as much as I don't like to admit it, Michelle Lee Marnwall is right that those are not the questions that Paul starts with. Paul starts with questions like those that you see on your screen here. And there's one of those questions, all three of them are important. There's one that I want to direct your attention to especially, and it's the third question. Who has the capacity to produce positive social change? Now, our first instinct when we're answering that question in Paul's context is to say the husband. And that's true. That's right. There's nothing wrong with answering the question that way. And I think that's really going to frame what we talk about next week when we talk about Paul's instructions to husbands. It also explains why Paul, in part, explains why Paul doesn't start with the obligation to love when he's talking to wives here. He wants husbands to lead out in that regard because they're the ones that have the capacity to change the quality of their relationship with their wives. They're the ones that have the capacity, for the most part, to change the way that the Christian community functions. And that's really what Paul is interested in. But we will see that wives do have the capacity to produce moral change. And it's important for us to make that observation and to keep it in mind as we move through this text. I'll point out why that's important later on. Notice that Paul also wants us to start with the right virtues. We listed those out in our teaching last week. Mutual love, holiness, wisdom, spirit-filled wisdom, we should really say, and especially mutual submission. Those are to be the virtues that shape how all of the believers in Ephesus relate to one another. And there are no exemptions. Now, what Paul will do later is tease out how that actually looks when you have real social inequity. So, parents, children, master, slaves. But what he's doing here is he's just reminding us that these are the virtues that should frame the way that we live. Now, what is a virtue? A virtue is a habit that shapes our character. And the most important thing for you to notice is that Paul does not code these virtues for gender. In the ancient world, it was common for philosophers to divvy up. Well, these virtues are manly, these virtues are womanly. And of course, the manly virtues were valued more highly. That's not how Paul does his virtue lists. They apply to everyone, which is really remarkable because Paul believed, just like all Orthodox Christians today, and I mean Orthodox with a lowercase o, not capital O, believe today, Paul believed that men and women were different, that God made them to be different. And yet, Paul doesn't code virtues for gender. And what that means for us is that we need, and I didn't say this Sunday, but what that means for us is that we need to think long and hard about what it means to be human before we think about what it means to be male or female. Okay? Then Paul gives us a couple of assumptions that should frame our starting point, a couple of ways of describing our posture that ought to frame our engagement with the household. One is a posture of worship. And worship has a way of changing us. It doesn't always change the situation, um, but it does change us. Benjamin Hastings and Blessing Offer are right about that. The other thing that he wants us to do, Paul wants all people in the household to do, is to have a posture of reverential fear. And I think Lynn Cohick is right about this in her commentary on Ephesians. There is an assumption that to revere Christ, to show reverence for Christ, is to show reverence for his people. We'll see Paul make that point explicit to wives in verse 33, but I think that it is a controlling feature of how Paul frames the entire household code. By the way, Cohick likes to use the word deference for our little Greek friend hupatasomai, or hupatasso, I should say. And I think that's a really neat way to put that. Rather than submission or subordination or being subject to, she uses the word deference, showing deference. I think that's a really good way to think about that word. Now, when we start at these places that Paul has given us to start, what we realize is there's some things that Paul does not say. And what Paul does not say may be just as important as what he does say. Notice one thing that Paul does not say is that the husband is the Lord or the Savior of his wife. He does not fulfill those roles for her. Only Christ can. Now that's really important because of something else that Paul said. Well, it's really important in its own right. Wives stand on their own in the presence of Christ. But it's really important when it is combined with another thing that Paul does not say. Paul does not say that husbands are to force their wives to submit or to ensure that their wives submit. There is no enforcement mechanism here. That is absolutely vital because it is the first hint for us that when Paul uses hupatasso, he may mean something a little bit different than what his ancient counterparts meant when they used that term. For Paul, submission cannot be forced. Oh, you can subjugate someone, but you cannot force them to submit, to subordinate, to defer. That is something that only the social inferior can do. It is a gift, not a requirement. So there is no enforcement mechanism. And really it speaks to just Paul's overall view of the human person. Paul sees individuals as moral actors. Yes, he addresses congregations all the time. He is speaking to congregations, but he is speaking to congregations made up of individuals who must choose daily to put his commands into practice. That's very important, especially in a world that oftentimes assumed that women, children, slaves, did not have the intellectual or moral capacity to be virtuous, to have character. They must be forced to do what is right. You see some of the other things that Paul does not say here. Um, he doesn't say that, all women are to submit to all men. I think that's an important one as well, because Paul does not want to facilitate the sexual abuse of women on the part of men through a call to submission. Paul does not command, I want to skip down to the last one here. Paul does not command women to submit to men's authority. He doesn't call wives to submit to their husband's authority. No, they are to submit to their husband. This is a relational activity. It is an activity that is chosen, but it is also an activity that is done because of the quality of the relationship. That's why Paul does not command wives to obey their husbands. Paul knows the word obey. He could have used it. He doesn't. Now, some skeptics will say, well, yeah, but other philosophers also used this word submit, but then they would use it coupled with obey. These things mean the same thing. No, actually, in Paul, they don't. That's important for us to carry forward as we think about what Paul does, in fact, say. Now, I want you to look here at verse 23, and that's where we're really going to start. We're going to start with Paul's justification. And his justification is that the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. My sense of this is that Lynn Cohick, in her commentary, makes a very persuasive argument that Paul is talking here primarily and perhaps even only in terms of source. But either way, we need to acknowledge that this is a metaphor, and that metaphors are never perfect. And what I mean by never perfect is they never match up one to one. Paul even acknowledges that fact on down in verse 32, where he's like, he's waxing eloquent about Christ and the church, and it's, the husband and the wife, and he's like, I'm really talking about Christ and the church. And we all kind of look at him and go, yeah, right, Paul. But Paul throws that in there because he wants you to understand that this is not a perfect analogy. Now, I just said that I think source rather than authority is the chief thing here. Notice there in verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of whom he is the, you expect Paul to say, Lord. He does not. He says, Savior. Savior. Now, that is really interesting. Christ is certainly the Lord of the church, and he certainly has authority over the church, but that is not the aspect of the analogy that Paul is highlighting here. He is highlighting Christ's redemptive work on behalf of the church, something that he has done throughout Ephesians. So much so, in fact, that in chapter 1, what does Paul do? He says, well, Christ is the head over all things for the church. Paul knows how to frame headship in terms of authority. Okay? No, he is shaping this metaphor in terms of Christ's saving activity. Where he does refer to Christ's lordship is in the wife's submission to Christ, which is to be the model for how she submits to her husband. And again, as we've had, all along here, we get just one more hint that Paul has something different in mind than mere obedience. Paul has in mind a true laying of one's self aside for the sake of the other. That's what the wife does for her husband. She lays aside herself for him. Now, by the way, this is something Lynn Cohick points out, and I didn't mention this on Sunday, but Paul does not lay upon the wife the burden of pleasing her husband, which is also very interesting. No, he simply says, submit to your husband, lay yourself aside, put yourself second. Now that has a whole universe of implications. A whole universe of implications. And it's a whole universe of implications that wives need to seriously consider, both before they get married and afterwards. But from a man's point of view, I can tell you that a wife who lives out this vision does things that are incredibly beautiful, does things that are incredibly wonderful. And they model for her husband I'll just say it, a love that is truly Christ-like. That's really a good natural transition into what Paul says to wives. Subordinate yourselves to your husbands. But here's the thing. When the wife does that, she's not doing something extraordinary. She is simply extending the ethics of the kingdom to the household. And she is modeling for her husband how to practice mutual submission. So in effect, just as the husband has the capacity to make this positive social change, both in his household and in the church at large, the wife shows him how to do that. She models for him how to live out this life of mutual submission, because you see, in Paul's culture, men were not taught to be submissive. They were not taught to be deferential. They were taught to be strong and assertive. There's a lot of toxic models of masculinity floating around on the internet. None of those contain this Christian distinctive of being deferential, of showing deference, of laying oneself down. Wives still have an important function in discipling their husbands. That's part of what Paul's doing here. Now, verse 33 is often neglected. And what Paul is doing here in verse 33 is quite interesting. He picks up that idea of reverential fear from verse 21, and he brings it down to shape what he wants wives to do. He wants them to show this reverence for their husband, to acknowledge what he needs in his social environment to give him what he needs and to get out of the way. And in the process, what she's doing is she's modeling for the rest of her household, as well as perhaps for her husband and other people in the church, the kind of reverence that needs to just be part of our lives. I'll never forget, and I know I've told this story before to our church, but I'll never forget being the recipient of this kind of reverence from someone who had no business giving me this kind of deference. I was at an awards banquet at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I had won the James, Leo, and Marta Ann Garrett Award in historical theology. And the man for which the award was named, James Leo Garrett, was seated at my table. And he spoke to me with such deference. I felt ashamed and embarrassed. It's funny, my thesis supervisor, Bruce Corley, walked up to me while I was sitting there and said, "Wade, are you actually going to be crass enough to accept an award in historical theology?" And he had this big Cheshire cat grin on his face. And I was trying to figure out what to say, and Dr. Garrett, Dr. Garrett stepped up and said, "Now, Bruce, you know that someone can be a specialist in more than one field." And I wanted to crawl under the table. I had no right to be called a specialist in that field by the man who helped establish the field, especially at Southwestern. But it was beautiful, and I have remembered that my entire life. Dr. Garrett has passed on, but I cannot wait to enter glory and to share with him what his example meant to me. Wives, teaching your husbands, modeling for them, because you don't really teach this, you model it. Modeling for your husbands, modeling for your children, modeling for other people in the church. This kind of deference has the capacity to change people's lives. It's beautiful. It's absolutely glorious. And what I really want us to do is to reflect upon that glory. Because look, if you just see Paul as one more ancient misogynist, or if you see these comments as, something directed to something that has nothing to do with us in the modern world, I get it. You're just kind of like, why should we even bother with this? But my contention has been throughout this teaching, and in fact throughout this little series within a series, that Paul is articulating for us a vision of the Christian life, not a vision of family life, a vision of the Christian life that is powerful, that is authentic, that is beautiful. Now, there's a couple of starting points that we need to recognize that Paul has. A couple of presuppositions that Paul has that his ancient hearers you may not have had, and Paul wants to drive these home. First of all, we already mentioned this. Paul posits no distinction in nature between men and women. None. Both have the same capabilities because both were created human by God, both created in his image. And Paul you know, Paul takes Jesus and the imitation of Jesus as the model for everyone who calls upon his name and is saved. The imitation of Christ is our model, all of us, whether we are husbands or wives. Because of those presuppositions, Paul has some things to say that are different than what other ancient philosophers would have said. Paul treats wives as though they are moral agents with the full capacity to make their own decisions about how they're going to live. And in so doing, he's taking upon himself a truly Jewish understanding of human nature. In fact, a more Jewish understanding than some rabbis of the period. Now, look, because of that, but well, Paul may sound just like some of his ancient counterparts, but what he's saying is radically, radically different. It has been radically reshaped, and Paul never forgets the mutuality of these relationships. There's a mutual obligation. There is true reciprocity here. That's the social science word. But that mutuality is especially intense as Paul describes marriage. For Paul, marriage is not supposed to be an arena of social conflict. It is not supposed to be characterized by mutual suspicion, animosity, or subjugation. It is supposed to be characterized by mutual love, dare I say, by mutual submission, by the imitation of Christ. And it is that imitation that wives are to imitate, not some sort of artificial vision of femininity created to address the anxieties and instabilities of a particular age. Ladies, your job is not to uh, to be at your husband's beck and call about every little thing. Your job is to imitate Christ. Your job is actually harder than what the world or what these you know fake theologians online would give you. It is to be Christ to your husband. Just as Paul will say explicitly that your husband is to be Christ to you. May it be so, for it is in our marriages, as much as any other arena in life, that we have the power to model a new and better way to be human, one taught to us by Jesus, our Savior.